morning. It's Monday, May 11th. I saw where the MTA is getting a grant from the federal government for $3.9 billion in order to keep the subways and buses and toll booths and trains running during the coronavirus situation. Because obviously, with the stay at home, very few people are riding public transportation. Now, it's very expensive from what I could find in my research. The annual budget for the MTA is roughly $16 billion. There's something like 8 million people ride the buses and the subways during the day, each day. Then you got cars that come over the bridges and through the tunnels that pay tolls every day. And they got 75,000 people working for the MTA. So it's a monumental task. And originally, when the subways first started, they were owned by independent people, by companies. They were owned by corporations, people who built the subway system and owned the trains and took care of the tracks and everything. And they had names like the Independent Subway and the IRT, the BMT, right? And eventually, those companies ran into a lot of problems. They couldn't make enough money, and so a series of government organizations took them over, and eventually we end up with the MTA, which is headed by the governor of New York, and I believe they have 7 board members, and there's a head board member. But the board really can't do much without the approval of the members. And so, they'll try to raise fares or something in order to keep the subways and buses and everything running properly. And in my mind, there has to be a better system. I think public transportation is a right. It's almost like health care in my mind. You really ought to be able to trust it, that you're going to get someplace every day in a reasonable amount of time at a reasonable price. And I don't think the price right now is reasonable for a lot of people who have to take the subway every day. I think the subways cost like $3 one way now. And so that's $6 a day. And if you're making minimum wage, that's a lot of money that you're paying to ride the subway. So I think something has to be done about it. I think people have to sit down and think about how we can fund the subways more efficiently. I was thinking somewhere along the line of like a transportation tax, where everybody in the country pays a certain amount of money for the transportation, the public transportation that would exist in their area of the country. So New York, Connecticut, New Jersey are all part of the MTA. Our taxes, transportation tax, would go to them, as opposed to paying this tax to the federal government in some way, shape, or form, and then we have to beg to get that money back. See, that's very distasteful to me when we got to beg the federal government to get money back. And then, as New York knows, we don't get back as much as we put into the federal government. So I really think that public transportation is a right. And that if we had more public transportation, more good public transportation, then we would have less problems with climate change. But then again, there's certain parts of this country where they have virtually no public transportation. So I'm sure my idea would not go over well in some parts of the country. But if you looked at the country as a whole, there are major population areas where maybe 100 million people live, and they need public transportation. So that's my first rant of the day, the need for public transportation. And here's a kicker to the situation. It may very well be that the fate of large cities will be on the decline due to the virus, due to COVID-19. For many people, the image of city life has changed drastically because of COVID-19. They are considering ditching the city in favor of a less dense suburb or rural area. The virus-fueled urban exodus would only pile on to an existing trend away from the cities. So think about this in light of funding public transportation. Wouldn't it be a bitch to spend all this money fixing up public transportation and have the city's population decrease by several million people? What do the urban planners in this country think about that? If they even think about that. You know, large U.S. metro areas have already seen a slow population growth, probably because of the expense of living in the city. So now you've got net losses even before the pandemic struck. And this is only going to exacerbate the situation. So what good is my rant if I don't have an answer? But I do. How about some high-speed trains, bullet trains from, say, the outlying suburbs like Stony Brook or Poughkeepsie or Patchogue? How about bullet trains from those areas that will get people into the city in 45 minutes or so? And how about some hovercraft that streaks across the Sound or down the Hudson River or down the South Shore of Long Island that can bring people into the city in an hour or so from places like Patchogue or Shirley or Tarrytown or Nyack. I'll leave Montauk out because that's a little bit far. So, you know, there are answers lurking somewhere in the mind of somebody who's warped like me. Let's hope that guy comes to the forefront or that gal comes to the forefront. So that's it for today.